Hey everybody, it's Kendall from the Recording Lounge podcast, and today I'm doing a video about saturation, compression, harmonic content, harmonic distortion, and mixing for loudness. So I just had a podcast about this, an hour and 23 minutes or something. So go check out that. It's the Recording Lounge podcast. You can go listen on iTunes or your favorite podcast player, but talk a lot about mixing for loudness. Now, I'm going to play you two clips of some drums to describe what I'm talking about first. So, peak level is something that is virtually useless to us when talking about loudness, and this is a great example of why. These two drum clips that I'm about to play you have the exact same peak level, but one of them sounds much louder. So check out down here, we're going to look at the peak levels as they go by. So I'm going to play you each one. So here's the first one. Okay, so you can see that the peak level here peaked at -3 dBFS. So we're going to play you this next clip, and you're going to notice it sounds a lot louder, but technically on paper, the peak level is the same. Notice, -3 dBFS. I'm going to switch back and forth between these two so you can hear how much difference there is in level in between the two clips. However, your peak meter in Pro Tools or Nuendo or Cubase or Logic or Reason or Reaper or any of those programs, they're all going to register this. They're going to register these as peaking at the exact same level. So this is a perfect description of why peak level is virtually useless when describing loudness. What we care about with loudness is RMS level or average level. That's what our ear responds to. Nobody here that's listening to this video thinks that this one is quieter. It sounds louder. I mean, it just sounds louder. And that's because on average, it is louder. You can see the difference between how peaky this one is, how much these peaks jump out, and how you have more of this sort of meat of this signal here. And that means that it's got a higher RMS level. Now, how do we mix for loudness? Well, I have a lot of questions on the podcast about this, about, well, I sent it to mastering and it couldn't get it that loud without really sounding bad. And part of it is that a lot of people think that mastering is supposed to be your loudness treatment, when in fact, loud mixes come from the very beginning of the chain when it comes to your mic choices and your preamp choices and your mic positioning and just the tone of what you're recording, all kinds of things. To demonstrate that, I've got an acoustic guitar. So I've got a normal acoustic guitar here, and I've got one with a high boost and one with a high cut. So this would simulate maybe choosing different microphones or using EQ in the mix or when recording. Now, you can already see, look how much different these waveforms look. This one's got higher peaks, and it's because it's got more top end. So let's listen to them. This is the normal acoustic. High boost. Notice how that one on average actually sounds quieter, but because it's got that brightness, it's probably peaking around the same area. It's impossible to just get a hold on your entire mix with a master limiter, because if you've got drums and bass and guitars and vocals and all that stuff, every time those drum hits hit the limiter, it's going to push down the whole mix. And so without, you can't get a nice loud master without affecting everything. So that's why it needs to be handled in the mix, because if you can take control of those peaks of whatever it may be, an acoustic guitar, drums, vocals, if you can take control of those in a way that sounds good to you, and that doesn't destroy what you've got going on dynamically, it's much easier to get a loud mix. Now, I should say I'm not a proponent of the loudness war. I don't think that we should really be trying to make mixes, insanely loud. I like dynamics, but it is a real factor, and we do need to make mixes that are at least somewhat loud to compete in the market. Now, do I think they need to be -6 RMS? No, I think that's way too loud. But they also can't be -16 RMS, because that's going to get lost if you're listening on shuffle. Anyway, so let's look at another test here. I've got the same acoustic, the normal acoustic guitar. I'm going to pull this back to normal level. Now, this is the same clip, but one of these has saturation on it. Now, a lot of people, when they think of saturation, they think about, distortion almost. But saturation can be incredibly subtle, and it really can help tame these peaks. Notice how much more tame the peaks are on this track. We're going to listen to them back to back, and you might hardly even notice the saturation on this one. So I'm going to color this one slightly different. So this is the saturated one. This is the normal one. So they really don't sound that much different. This one certainly doesn't sound distorted. I mean, sure, some of those peaks, there's just a little bit of saturation going on, but it's not enough to actually sound like distortion. And saturation can be very subtle. Saturation, a lot of us talk about tapes and tubes and all these, analog technologies that added saturation and character and, would control those peaks. So when you would record an acoustic guitar into tape, the waveform might look more like this as opposed to this, which is one of the reasons why in the digital domain it can be a little bit harder for us to take control of our mixes, and why in the analog domain it's much easier because the gear actually helps tame those transients in a transparent way that's pleasing. And you can push it to where it's not transparent, but you get the point. You can also see here that the saturated acoustic guitar is peaking almost 4 dB lower than the main acoustic, but to the ear they sound almost the same. That's because we're saturating and clipping off those peaks in a nice, pleasing way, but it's on paper. This one is much quieter because of the peak level. Now again, RMS level is all we really care about. That's what makes things loud to us. So keep in mind that if we sent this acoustic into a limiter, the limiter is going to think these are the peaks, and it's going to try to deal with that by pulling down the signal like a normal limiter or compressor does. Whereas if we send a limiter this signal, it's going to be affected by more of these lower level peaks. And so that is a different sound, and generally speaking, it can be a more pleasing sound. Now this acoustic was recorded with a Neumann KM184, and I played it, and I use a fairly heavy pick, but I play decently lightly. So I use a 1.5 millimeter pick, but I play pretty light. These peaks would be much, much higher if I were to use a thin pick. So that's one more factor, how you record it, what you choose to use. If I had also used smaller strings, I use 13 gauge strings. If I were using 11s or 12s, these peaks would also be higher because they'd have more of that upper mid and high frequency content. So this acoustic track was saturated using the UBK1 saturator, which is one of my favorite, well, it's also a compressor, but it's one of my favorite plugins for that. I'm going to show you sort of what happens. So I've got, I'll pull up UBK1 here. All right, so with this plugin, I'm going to turn off all the compression, turn the mix down all the way on the saturation side, and what I want you to do is watch this level, okay? I'm going to drag this up. Watch the level here on this acoustic, and watch what happens as I pull up the saturation. Okay, notice how it's almost like the level gets slowly more and more contained. Now, a lot of people, when they hear saturation, they get afraid because they think that this is what I'm talking about. And that's not it, okay? I'm talking about subtle bits of saturation. This was, saturated just barely with the UBK1, and you can see how effective it was at controlling those peaks. Now, a lot of times when we use compression, we try to make a compressor do this by, evening out peaks. But honestly, in my opinion, saturation is much more effective for that type of work because it's dealing with the peaks. Now, this is an argument that I've made in the past for multiple compressors in series because let me zoom in on this and we'll talk about it. All right, so if we've got this acoustic guitar and we set our compressor threshold somewhere maybe here, and we do, let's say a medium-high ratio, 6:1, 8:1, something like that, and we compress just like a dB, okay? Only the stuff above this line is going to be triggering those compressors, and it's going to be trying to take down these peaks. Well, if you wanted to compress, say, 8 dB on something, you would actually, your threshold would be lower, right? Because you have to pull your threshold down into this region. So this region of the signal is actually triggering that compressor. As you pull that threshold down into this wave, right, on your compressor, your threshold is going down, 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 down. So now these lower peaks are actually triggering the compressor, versus if you have 2 compressors or 3 compressors in series, and each one is only being triggered by the highest peaks, then you can get a little bit of compression here, and then you do another stage here and another stage here, and you're not actually triggering the compressor on this lower level material. And that is part of the argument that I'm making, is that in an analog studio or in a hybrid studio, we're going to have a little bit of saturation from tube mics and from tube mic pre's, or like Neve style pre's. We're going to have tube compressors and solid state compressors. We're going to have tube EQs and solid state EQs. We're going to have, potentially a console. So all these tiny little layers of saturation add up to just shaving off a little bit of that peak, shaving off a little bit of that peak, shaving off a little bit of that peak. And that makes it much more controllable in a mixed situation. And it also, can be fairly invisible, as you've heard here. You don't hear this as distortion. It sounds a little bit crunchy on some of those louder hits, but in the context of a mix, you'd never hear it. And the good thing is, because we're really only saturating those peaks, if it was a quiet section of the song or, a more finger-picked section, it probably wouldn't even be triggering the saturation, so you wouldn't hear it anyway. But when the whole band comes in, this allows it to sit a little bit better, and you might not even need to compress something if you've got these peaky, things poking out, if you've got those under control. So the next thing I want to talk about is saturation a little bit more, and sort of describe the other benefits of saturation, which is sort of this harmonic coloration. Now, you've probably heard this term, harmonic distortion, but what does it mean? So what I've got here, I'm going to pull up a 1K test tone. Okay, I'm going to go just to my mixer here, and I've got a 1K test tone. I'm just going to turn this down because we don't need to hear it there. And I'm going to pull up FabFilter Pro Q2. There we've got our 1K test tone, right? We can see it. And I'm going to pull up different saturation plugins and show you what these are doing. Okay, so as we pull this up, I'm going to give you just a tiny bit of level. Okay, as we're going to turn this on and make our mix. Okay, you can already see we're adding harmonic content above that signal, above that fundamental. So imagine this is a note that somebody is singing, right? Or even a note that a guitar is playing. As you bring up the saturation, Okay, you get more harmonics coming through here. You bring it up even more. Okay, so this is what is almost like distortion. And really, that's all that harmonic saturation is. Like, distortion is just an infinite collection of harmonics. And harmonics are, octaves and fifths above, and 2 octaves and 3 octaves and all this stuff above the fundamental note. So this is actually adding musical character. It's adding, aggression in the mid-range. It's adding brightness. It's adding some extra zing and sparkle on top. And again, it can be very subtle. On that acoustic guitar, I might have been saturating like that. You can hear those extra high tones. If you're listening on decent speakers or headphones, you can hear those extra high tones come out. Right? So I wasn't saturating that much, but it's adding a little bit of clarity up top while at the same time shaving off those peaks so they're not so peaky and triggering other compressors, and that makes it much easier for it to be loud without really sounding like you compressed it, because compression doesn't quite do the same thing. Okay, I would urge you to try not to use compression to get something, to control peaks so much as get a good sound, raise your RMS level. But compression is not the same as saturation. We're going to use a different plugin now. This is the soft tube saturation knob. This plugin is free, I believe, and it's really great. It's a little more sensitive than the UBK, but it's still great. So check this out. As we start raising this saturation knob, so you're quickly getting into that territory. Okay, very heavy distortion on this, but you can subtly do it, and you get a nice saturation, very subtle. And a lot of times people will they can't hear this, and so they say, okay, well, I've got to turn up here. Well, now it sounds distorted. Exactly, that's the point, is that nice subtle saturation is subtle, and you can't hardly hear it. And that's what's beautiful about it, is that it can control peaks in a very transparent and pleasing way. So even something like this could actually tame those peaks. So that's what I challenge you to do, is if you're not sure if you're hearing it quite right, watch the meters here and see what the peaks do. See how they get contained. One more plugin I want to try out. This is a classic. It's one of my favorites. Decapitator from Sound Toys. Okay, there's a lot of different types of modes on this plugin, so we're going to show you kind of some of the different ones. As we pull this up, see, the meter is only hitting -10 here, and it doesn't really sound that saturated. Right, this is totally dry. This is with it in, and so the meter is only hitting -10, but you still are getting some harmonic coloration. As I drive it, obviously you're getting a lot there. But let's put it to 0 and just compare the different modes. Okay, so that adds quite a bit more. Notice how this harmonic is lower in this one than in that one. Now this one actually is dropped quite a bit in level. So if we equalize it there and make it all normalized to 0, okay, now you've got these extra harmonics up here. Okay, and so all of them sound slightly different depending on what you're doing. Now the cool thing about the UBK and about the Decapitator is that you can saturate it to where you can hear it, but then blend in some of your dry signal. Again, this is dry, and you can just barely blend in that saturation. So that technique might work better for you. If you're having a hard time hearing this, with just a little saturation, you can go to the point where you really start to hear it and then blend it back to be more subtle. So that's just a description of saturation and mixing for loudness, and some of the various techniques that you can use to get louder mixes that have things that sit in the pocket without tons and tons of compression. Now I want to go back to this really quick and talk about the fact that on these drums, how I got them so much louder is by the use of compression and saturation. So I used a little bit of saturation to tame those peaks, and then I compressed it in parallel, and maybe 80% wet, 20% dry. But if you really, now that you know what you know, you can see the drums sound thicker, fuller, but they don't sound like crazy compressed. I mean, they definitely sound compressed, but they're not like insanely compressed. If I level match these a little bit more, and I'm level matching to the average, sort of what my ear thinks. Okay, these maybe sound fairly close in level. It's difficult because this is so much more poppy and punchy, but you can see how much quieter this is. So I hope this has given you some things to consider about transients and compression and saturation, and making sure that your transients are tame in the mix process and not trying to just get all your loudness out of the master, because it's a much more effective process to view saturation and compression as subtle stages, 10 or 15 subtle stages, from the mic that you choose to the preamp and the EQ to maybe a little bit of compression or saturation on, let's say, your snare drum, and then you've got a drum bus compressor, and then maybe you've got a master bus compressor, and none of them have to be doing 8 dB of compression, but if you do subtle stages of a couple dB of compression, it winds up sounding much more natural, and you can get it loud without having to try to rely on your mastering engineer to get your mix loud, which is always much harder than you realize if the mix has out of control transients. So if you have any questions, please email me at recordingloungepodcast@gmail.com. Check out the podcast on iTunes or any of your favorite podcast channels. It's called Recording Lounge. I'll talk to you guys soon.